Somewhere in the mountain provinces of Iga, in the autumn of 1581, a man who had been captured 3 days earlier sat in a room without windows. He had no name anyone could verify. He carried no documents. The men who questioned him had done this before, and none of them had seen anything like it. They applied fire. He did not break. They applied blades across the deep tissue. He did not break. What came out of his mouth was a prepared narrative, internally consistent, useless to his captors, delivered in a voice that had not changed pitch since the moment they brought him in. His face, which had been calm when they dragged him through the door, remained calm when they started working on him in earnest. On the 4th day, he died. Not from the interrogation. The wounds were survivable. He died because whatever had been running through his blood when they captured him had finished its work, and the body that had been chemically held together finally came apart. The textbooks will tell you the ninja were masters of disguise, trained acrobats who survived on discipline, and a warrior code so total it could override the body's response to pain. That what separated the shinobi from ordinary men was years of hardening, the kind of conditioning that turned a farm boy from the Iga Mountains into a weapon that could not be broken. For 400 years, that was the answer. A creed, a tradition, a school of suffering. Then historians began reading the actual manuals, the ones that had been locked in temple archives, the ones that had not been translated into any European language. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The conditioning was real. But the thing that sealed those men against the one weapon every lord in the Sengoku period eventually tried to use on them was not character. It was inside their blood. And it had been put there deliberately by the institution that sent them out. To understand what the manuals exposed, you have to first understand what the shinobi actually were, not what the films invented, what the documents recorded. The ninja did not emerge from legend. The shinobi tradition took its recognizable institutional form during the Sengoku period, the era of warring states that consumed Japan between the mid-15th and early 17th centuries. A battle could be decided before it started, depending on what a lord knew about his enemy's supply lines, his fortifications, and the temper of his garrison commanders. What the shinobi provided was not brute force. It was precision in the dark. The institution that produced them was called a ryu, a school. The most documented of these were the Iga Ryu and the Koka Ryu, rooted in the mountain provinces of central Honshu, where the terrain itself formed a natural barrier against the large armies that swept the lowlands. At the top of the hierarchy sat the jonin, the commander who accepted contracts without ever appearing in the field. Below them were the chunin, the middle operators. At the operational level were the jinin, the men and women who put their hands on the actual work. The jinin was not a free agent. He was the output of a production line. He was selected young. He was trained across multiple disciplines for years. He learned languages, regional dialects, the dress and mannerisms of different social classes. He learned infiltration, disguise, and the management of information under pressure. He also learned, in the final hours before a mission, what to put inside his body. This is the part the popular record has circled for 4 centuries without ever landing on. The Bansenshukai, compiled in 1676 by Fujibayashi Yasutake of the Iga school, is the most complete surviving document of shinobi operational doctrine. It runs to 22 volumes. Most of its contents have never been fully translated into a European language. The pharmacological sections, when the plant descriptions inside them are matched against the botanical record and the active compounds are identified by modern chemistry, overturn almost every part of the textbook story about what made the shinobi what they were. The first substance is the one documented most directly. Its name in the Japanese tradition is chosen Asagao, the morning glory of Korea, a member of the Solanashi family, the same nightshade group that produced henbane and mandrake in the European pharmaceutical tradition. In the Western pharmacological literature, it is called datura. The active compounds are hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine. All 3 are tropane alkaloids acting on the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors of the central nervous system. The clinical profile is documented across 2 centuries of modern toxicological literature, and it matches what the period accounts describe about captured shinobi, with a precision that the discipline hypothesis never came close to providing. Scopolamine produces anterograde amnesia, the clinical term for the inability to form new retrievable memories during the period of its action. A man whose system carries working concentrations of scopolamine cannot be broken under interrogation in the conventional sense because the drug has interrupted the chain between the stimulus and the brain's capacity to process it as something requiring a response. He does not betray the Ryu's operational network because the compound has fragmented his capacity to retrieve and organize that information under acute stress. The network is in his memory. The drug has closed the door between the memory and the mouth. He does not scream because the tropane alkaloids have separated the pain signal from the nervous system's capacity to translate it into a scream. He is not brave. He is buffered. Hyoscyamine produces severe agitation rather than sedation, an elevated heart rate, flushed and heated skin, hallucinations with violent content, and a willingness to move toward danger that in an unmedicated man would require a reason. At controlled doses, these effects translate into the capacity to perform physical tasks through wounds that would have stopped the same man an hour before the preparation entered his body. The dose required to produce this profile without cardiac arrest sits in a window so narrow that it is clinically dangerous territory for anyone but a trained specialist. Too little, and the fear response remains intact. Too much, and the heart stops before the mission begins. Only an experienced handler who had grown the plant, prepared the extraction, and calibrated the amount against the weight and condition of the specific man receiving it could navigate that margin. The Ryu controlled the dose. The Ryu controlled the timing. The genin did not self-administer. He was prepared by the institution. The second substance is cannabis. Taima, as it was known in the Japanese tradition, had been cultivated on the Japanese archipelago since the Jomon period, the pre-agricultural phase of Japanese prehistory that ended roughly 3,000 years ago. Its pharmacological properties were documented in the Chinese and Japanese medical literature that the shinobi schools demonstrably consulted. The active compound is delta-9-tetrahydrocannabinol. At moderate doses, THC produces measurable suppression of the acute fear response, dissociation between the sensation of pain and the emotional reaction to it, and a narrowing of attention onto a single fixed objective. A man loaded with THC at working doses does not panic. He does not flinch at the last moment. He does not deviate from a task once it has been set in motion. Working alongside the datura preparation, the cannabinoid extended the duration of pain suppression and dampened the inflammatory cascade that would otherwise have incapacitated a wounded operative within hours of blade contact. The third component is aconitine, the active compound of the plant the Japanese called torikabuto, the wolf's bane, which grew across the mountain provinces of Iga and Koka, where the Ryu gathered its botanical materials. In the Japanese and Chinese assassination traditions, aconitine at lethal concentrations was a contact poison applied to blades and arrowheads. At sublethal microdoses, it is something fundamentally different. Modern clinical research on aconitine's pharmacological profile has documented measurable analgesic effects at concentrations far below the toxic threshold. The margin between the dose that suppresses pain and the dose that stops the heart is clinically narrow in a way that makes improvisation lethal. Only a pharmacological tradition that had been calibrating that margin for generations, testing the window in real operational conditions across 3 centuries of institutional practice, could administer it with any consistency. The Ryu had been doing exactly that, compress all of this into the body of a single genin in the hours before deployment. His nervous system is carrying tropane alkaloids that have chemically sealed the connection between operational memory and output under stress. His pain threshold has been elevated by cannabinoid and aconitine preparations layered on top of each other. His baseline fear response has been pharmacologically flattened by a combination that 3 separate chemical systems are producing simultaneously. This was not conditioning. This was applied chemistry administered by an institution that had inherited its pharmacological shelf from the Chinese and Japanese medical tradition and had spent 3 centuries translating general herbalism into operational deployment. The interrogation problem is the one the historical record cannot explain without the chemistry. A captured shinobi in the Sengoku period was a prize of the highest value. He carried operational intelligence, the identities of jonin who would never appear in the field, the locations of safe houses, the names of informants embedded inside the courts of lords who believed themselves secure. Every commander who captured one understood what was potentially inside that man's head. What came out under interrogation was never what went in. Period accounts described captured shinobi who endured the full toolkit of 16th-century Japanese military interrogation and produced nothing of operational value. A prepared narrative, internally consistent, impossible to disprove, delivered in a voice that did not change. And then, eventually, silence. For 400 years, the explanation was discipline. The shinobi had been trained to die rather than betray the Ryu. The pharmacology inverts that frame entirely. The shinobi did not resist through willpower. His nervous system had been chemically sealed at the moment of deployment. The scopolamine circulating in his blood when the mission began was still active when the guards closed in. It does not wear off on a schedule convenient to the interrogator. It wears off on a schedule determined by dose and metabolism. The torturer was working on a nervous system that had been made inaccessible before the man walked through the target's gate. 4 centuries of chroniclers saw this and reached for the only word available to them: fanaticism, the Eastern warrior's transcendence of the physical body. What it actually was, in the most literal pharmacological sense, was a chemistry that had been prepared inside a ryu, administered by a jonin or his designated specialist, and was still circulating in the man's bloodstream at the moment his captors thought they had captured something they could open. The institution itself ended on a precise historical date. In 1581, Oda Nobunaga launched the military campaign that the historical record calls the Tensho-Iga War. He sent an army estimated at 40,000 men into the mountain valleys where the Ryu had operated for generations. The shinobi communities of Iga had no standing force capable of meeting that army in open terrain. The Ryu scattered. The jonin fled into the surrounding provinces. The training sequences that had produced the genin were broken. The living repositories of the accumulated pharmacological and operational knowledge dispersed into the new political order Nobunaga was imposing across central Japan. What Nobunaga destroyed was not the pharmacological knowledge itself. He destroyed the institutional structure that had held it together and applied it with precision. The manuals were hidden, some were lost. The Bansenshukai, compiled nearly a century after the Tensho War, was itself a reconstruction, an attempt by Fujibayashi Yasutake to preserve what remained before it was entirely absorbed into the bureaucratic order of the Edo period. By the time the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated power in the early 17th century, the RU as operational institutions had ceased to function. The production line shut down. The men themselves did not end. The genetic record makes this specific. The Japanese genome is structured around 2 ancestral components. The older is Jomon ancestry, from the hunter-gatherer populations who inhabited the archipelago before wet rice agriculture arrived. The newer is Yayoi ancestry, carried by agricultural migrants from the Korean peninsula roughly 3,000 years ago. A landmark ancient DNA study published in Science Advances in 2021, drawing on genomes from sites across the Japanese archipelago including the Kinki region that contains Iga province, documented that inland mountain populations of central Honshu show elevated Jomon ancestry relative to coastal populations. The isolation of mountain terrain preserved older genetic components that diluted faster in more accessible lowlands. The people the Ryu recruited from the valleys of Iga were not biologically distinct. They were local men drawn from a community genetically continuous in those specific mountains for thousands of years before the Sengoku. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day Japanese populations have established direct continuity between the Sengoku period populations and the modern inhabitants of the same regions. The Y chromosome haplogroups documented in medieval burials from central Honshu are present at high frequencies in modern Japanese men from those same prefectures today. The genetic distance between a 16th-century farmer from the Iga valleys and a 21st-century resident of Mi prefecture is statistically negligible. The line did not break, not through the Tensho War, not through Edo period suppression, not through the Meiji modernization that dismantled the feudal order entirely, not through the industrial century that followed it, not through the present day. The Jinin was not a genetic outlier. He was a local man drawn from the population that farmed the same mountain valleys his ancestors had farmed for millennia before him. What set him apart was not his bloodline. It was the institution that selected him, trained him, prepared the preparation, and sent him out. Datura still grows across the Japanese archipelago. The same species, the same active molecules. Torikabuto still flowers in the same mountain meadows of Iga, where the Ryu gathered it for 3 centuries of operational use. Cannabis was cultivated on the Japanese archipelago for 10,000 years before modern governments began restricting it. The Bansenshukai is in university libraries. The plants are in the ground. The institution that held them together in a production line capable of producing a man who could not be opened by anything the Sengoku had available is gone. The men are not gone. The chemistry is not gone. The Ryu is older than its destruction. The destruction ended the production line. The mountains are the same mountains. The valleys are the same valleys. And the descendants of the men who drank what the Jonin prepared are still walking the same slopes of Iga. If you want more stories where the chemistry outlives the kingdom, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.